In this session, we are beginning now to get to the modern period, to the 19th century. And in the 19th century, the history of missions made a radical change. There is an explosion of missionary emphasis and interest that takes place in the 19th century, and there are a variety of factors that contribute to that. In this session, we're going to be looking at first some of the factors related to why modern missions, particularly 19th century Protestant missions, why it took off when it did, and then we'll also be talking about two very important early Protestant missionaries in the 19th century. As we've been mentioning before, of course, there's hasn't been a lot of missionary effort by Protestants in those first couple centuries, but beginning in the late early modern period and into the 19th century, there is a rather significant uptick. And there are a couple of things that are responsible for why the sudden change. One has to do with some of the changes that are taking place economically and in other aspects. The issues, for example, in trade that developed. As Europeans, imagine, of course, that a large portion of the world's Christians at this time, a large portion, are in Europe and in North America. So the more that those regions become involved in global trade, the more opportunities and the more interest there is in engaging other cultures with the Christian message. So, in many respects, some of this we see as early as the 15th century with Spanish and the Portuguese and others. As the explorers go out, interact with these indigenous cultures, the merchants then follow the explorers. If there aren't already missionaries involved or aren't already priests involved, often the merchants, the explorers would ask, kind of contact back home, ask for chaplains or ministers. These people then would come to minister to the European population and, in many cases, become interested in the indigenous populations around them. We've also seen in other cases, some people specifically going to these places for missionary efforts, but sometimes it was a matter of, now that we're in this context, seeing the people around us, we're becoming more interested in, these are more people that could be reached for Christ. And so as you have more explorers going out, as you have more merchants going out, there are more ships traveling places, missionaries have more opportunity to travel. And travel, of course, is becoming a little bit safer. It's still a very dangerous enterprise at this point. But as seafaring and shipbuilding continues to improve, it too continues to improve. It's always a dangerous enterprise through this time period. Another area that also affected modern missions was the improved education, particularly the ability to read. So as literacy increased, one area of literature that became popular among Christian audiences were stories of distant lands and great explorers. And so as people became more informed about these lands and these places, that sparked a spiritual interest in the people of these lands. What's being done about their souls? Right? Is anybody preaching to these people? And then, of course, as missionaries go to these people, the stories of those missionaries, those early missionaries, would be written down, shared, and people would be interested in the lives of these missionaries, which would encourage more interest in mission efforts. So education, as more people began to read, contributed to interest in missionary endeavors. A third factor was a general interest in Europe and especially England and in the United States in humanitarianism. right? Trying to reach out and help other people. And so, this not only affected missions, it affected, national endeavors as well. So people became more interested in helping people that were poor, helping people that were oppressed, and that also kind of was extended to people in other countries. Now, in many respects, yes, there was an ethnocentrism with the thoughts of our culture is better, and so we're going to help out these people. So cultural superiority, these people in other places are primitives. Later it gets referred to as kind of the white man's burden to help out these indigenous people. Right? It's not a good attitude. Certainly, it's not an approach that we should foster, but it did lead to this interest in trying to share the gospel with people. In many cases, though, for missionaries, there was also the idea that the people that they went and evangelized needed to adopt not just the Christian message, but Western civilization as well. And so the two were often very, very intricately intertwined. That to become Christian was also to become Western. And we've seen that in other expressions before. A third aspect that became important in fostering modern missions was a decrease of very hard Calvinistic outlook. Now, not everybody was a Calvinist. Not all Protestants were Calvinists. But in many respects, people that shared a Calvinist heritage up to this point were not particularly interested in missionary work. God had chosen those who were elect. God had chosen who those were that were going to be saved, and He would take care of making sure they heard the gospel message and that the Spirit acted on their hearts and that they were converted. Well, as some of those ideas began to soften, and so people don't hold them as strongly as they did, there's more interest in actively spreading the message, that there's this need to get out and share the message. Now, we've talked about, Calvin and a lot of those early Calvinists kind of suggested that God's means for getting, bringing the elect to a saved state was through preaching. So, there was a component within Calvinist theology that said people need to be actively preaching. But that kind of gets lost, and more of it is this, well, God's going to take care of it, we don't need to. But toward the 19th century, as some of those things begin to change, people started being more interested in missionary work. Revivalism also played a part in this as well. As it increases throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century, there is a lot of religious feeling. People interested in religious endeavors, not just personal piety, but the desire to share the message, the emphasis on the importance of conversion. And with the evangelical, one of the ideas that was important for evangelicalism was the idea that you should be active in spreading the message. It wasn't just somebody else's responsibility. Part of the new birth experience was to tell others the good news. And so revivalism led to more mission efforts as well. And then finally, although we could probably add more, the final one I want to emphasize is colonialism. Just in general, European culture was spreading throughout the late 18th, early 19th century. That, in turn, did provide, because there's an imperial presence, it did provide protection, so it was a little bit safer for missionaries and other Europeans to travel to some places. Often, though, it did connect the church to these various imperial powers. So, that really kind of had some problems. Often, the churches supported the empire, even in times when they took advantage or exploited or even harmed native peoples. Furthermore, as a lot of these places decolonized in the 20th century, churches often faced restrictions and losing of some of their cultural authority because they had been so tied to, Spain or England or France or, any of the variety of other imperial powers. So that there was a backlash, so to speak, because Christianity is seen as the religion of the oppressor. Even though, a lot of these churches by this time are indigenous, there's still that mindset of these are remnants of that imperial oppression. So with that foundation and thinking about the great changes that were taking place that led to modern missions, I want to talk about, in the rest of this session, two very important individuals in this modern mission movement that were especially important for the rise of modern missions. Often one of the first and one of the major ones that's listed as the father of modern missions is William Carey. And pretty much in any textbook you find, you're going to see William Carey listed as as a very important figure. Now, in some respects, that might not be absolutely 100% true. Carey worked with a team, and so in some ways, this early movement was a team effort. But it definitely was true in the sense that Carey writes these reports that get published, and so people in Britain and other places really connected with Carey. Right? Even though there's a team, there's a connection with Carey. So it's true in the sense of the imagination of people that are interested in missions, and that spurred people to support missions and get involved in missions. And so Carey becomes important, maybe not totally because he's like the pioneer and kind of some lone figure out here by himself, but because of the way in which people are thinking about what Carey is doing. Carey was born in England in 1761. He wanted to be a gardener, was kind of his early desires, but he had a lot of allergies, so that kind of prohibited him from gardening. He was baptized as an infant as an Anglican, but would later on become a Baptist. Much of that was during the revivals that took place there in the middle of the 18th century, late 18th century in Britain. He's converted by somebody he's working with. He's also influenced by the Moravians to some extent, influenced by the Wesleyan movement. So there's a lot of things that lead him to his conversion. He didn't have a lot of education, but he was very adept at learning languages, apparently. He learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Of modern languages at the time, he learned French and Dutch. So, that was, of course, a very important skill for his missionary work. But before he became a missionary, he worked as a cobbler, fixing shoes, worked as a teacher to support his family. He would actually get married to his master's sister-in-law, who was 5 years older, and so that's how his family got started. He would eventually start working as a pastor to two small Baptist churches. And again, his education often had a difficult, it was a difficult thing for him because he had to try to be ordained 3 times. And part of it is that education aspect. Well, here he is pastoring for 2 churches, and he comes across books about explorers. He reads David Brainerd's autobiography that we talked about in a previous session, and so he really becomes interested and concerned about missionary activity, not just general broad kind of missionary activity, but the need for him as well to be involved in mission action. He publishes a pamphlet in 1792. The shortened title of the pamphlet is An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. It's 87 pages long, so the actual document itself isn't very long. But the idea here is this, this idea of, particularly this idea of use means. Well, what does that mean? This is in reaction to that Calvinist notion, right? That God isn't just going to kind of sit back and convert the heathen. And so, you know, a lot of people at the time thought, especially if they were influenced by Calvinism, that missionary work was only to be done by the apostles. Other people thought, well, you know, it should only be done in connection with, or it was only done in connection with colonial efforts. And so this idea of using means is, you know, preaching, teaching, sending Christian literature. And so Carey is saying here, we got to be involved in missionary activity. We need to be, you know, using means, preaching, teaching, etc., to reach other people. Specifically, he was thinking of a missionary society, you know, a combination of people, some of whom were missionaries who would go abroad, and some of whom were people who kind of stayed where they were and provided the support needed by missionaries. Now, this was a little bit of a different approach than previous missionary efforts, especially, you know, Protestantism, of course. We talked a little bit about that last time. Different, of course, with the Catholic notions, and so these ideas of these missionary societies was something unique and different. There are 5 sections to this work, and I think it's a rather interesting aspect to it, and of course a very important work here in the Protestant history of Protestant missions. The first section was Carey laying out how important it was that modern Christians fulfill the Great Commission. You know, Carey wants to lay out that the Great Commission wasn't just something that was for the apostles, but throughout history, Christians were expected to be going into all the world. And so he lays out in the first section emphasis on that. The second section is what we might call a history of missions. And so he goes through different attempts to convert the non-Christian world, covering a wide variety of history, much of which you know, we've covered, and some things we've covered that, you know, he wasn't necessarily knowing about, but a lot of what we're doing in a very, very brief way. A third section had to do with, he laid out a variety of demographics, which suggests that he really put a lot of research into it, because he's breaking down population statistics and talking about the adherence of different religions in different regions. And so there's statistics and estimates and all these kind of things, kind of giving an impression to people of, you know, where are Christians, where are people that there aren't Christians, what, you know, what religions are present there. The fourth section focuses on what are the practical possibilities? What practical efforts could be made to, you know, move on and increase the spread of Christianity? In the fifth section, the focus is on kind of this final appeal, you know, what duties the Christian had with respect to this information, as well as what means could be used to evangelize the world. So a very important book has, you know, he lays out some very important things for this attempt to be more active in, you know, missionary effort. Later that year, he would preach a sermon encouraging similar things. Bases it on Isaiah 54 verses 2 and 3, which reads, "Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth in the curtains of thine habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords and strengthen thy stakes, for thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles and make the desolate cities to be inhabited." Right? So this idea he's pulling from this passage in Isaiah to suggest to Christians, right, we need to stretch the tent of Christianity, make it broader, make it bigger. And essentially he tells the congregation to expect great things from God and to attempt great things for God. So it's all about this idea of, you know, there's a great opportunity before us as Christians to evangelize the world. Let's do it. right? Let's try to win the world for Christ. So out of this, he would start the Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Among the Heathen. So one of these missionary type societies. A lot of, his original endeavor seems to have been, he wanted to be broader than just Baptists originally. But it ends up as basically just Baptists supporting him. The first contributions to the work only amounted to about $65, so there's not a huge response initially. Most of the early participants had very little money, right? Carey doesn't have a lot of money, his family doesn't have a lot of money, so the original people that are getting involved, they don't have a lot of money. So, it's not really a big response, but they still want to go forward. And so the society chooses Carey and a man named John Thomas to be the first missionaries. It is decided that they are going to be sent to India. Now, Carey's wife at the time doesn't want to go. She had to be persuaded to go. Careys have 3 young children. She's pregnant with the 4th. So she, it's not that she's necessarily against the ideas of missions, she's against the idea of them going to missions, especially to India. Now, John Thomas, on the other hand, he and his family are expected to go, he had gone to India previously as a doctor, had worked with the Royal Navy, and later did some efforts of, today we would call them medical missions probably, so he's kind of like doing some medical work, and he's also teaching Christianity a little bit, and so he's done some of that as well before this effort. But they aren't ready to get started. The plan is, let's go, and Thomas delays the effort because he's got some credit issues, and so they aren't ready to, he's got to settle with his creditors before they'll let him leave the country. Well, this gives time for Carey's wife to change her mind. So she decides, all right, let's go. And so they leave to go to India. In India, there are a lot of opposition. There's a lot of problems that they face. Some of that comes from the British East India Company. They're kind of in charge of the British section of India, and they're not particularly interested in missionary efforts to the natives. The East India Company even sends a representative to Parliament in London to try and stop missionary efforts. That's how opposed they are to this. They wouldn't even let Carey and his team on an East India Company ship. They have to actually sail with a ship coming from Denmark. Carey will end up working for the East India Company at some point down the line in order to support the ministry. So there is an effort, he does end up having to kind of concede to some things. So there's the opposition they face. There's illness and financial problems. There's some tension because the Thomases are living in Calcutta, and it seems like Thomas is using the missions funding to provide him with a wealthy lifestyle. And so they have a couple servants, they have a nice house. The Careys are in the interior part of India, and they're living in horrible conditions compared to what the Thomases are in Calcutta. So that leads to tension. The young son of the Careys dies. So that's another difficulty. The wife kind of develops, Carey's wife develops this kind of paranoia. She thinks that William is having an affair, and she would follow him throughout the town, accusing him of adultery while he's trying to preach. And ultimately he had to be locked in a room. She had to be locked in a room to not injure herself or others. Thomas also suffers from some mental issues as well. There's the challenge of learning the local Bengali language for the region where they are in order to preach. But he does, he's pretty successful with languages. But as he is preaching, there's not a great amount of success. It takes 7 years before somebody converts, finally. Once the first couple converts start coming in, though, the number grows fairly quickly after that. So, you know, they're getting some point where they are getting some traction. Well, because of the success, he sends for additional help. These missionaries and the Careys go to a Dutch-controlled area and set up another mission post in the city of Serampore. Here, they have less opposition. There's a husband and wife team, Joshua and Hannah Marshman, and another individual named William Ward. Joshua is a teacher. He helps found several schools. He too suffers some depression. So there's a lot of mental challenges a lot of these people have. Hannah is involved in some mission work, but she also primarily takes care of the Carey children, especially after the death of Carey's first wife, the one that had been paranoid, etc. William Ward is a printer, and so he prints a variety of literature, including the Bible translations that are eventually developed by Carey. And especially if the Ward and the others arrive, Carey spends a lot of time working on Bible translations. And he translates the Bible, sometimes in whole, sometimes in part, into 35 different languages. 6 of those are, he develops 6 complete Bibles. He develops 24 New Testaments, as well as 10 parts of Scripture in other languages. This group works well together. They have kind of a communal living arrangement. They make decisions together. And they eventually start a college to train Indians to be pastors, right? Indigenous leadership. But there's still a lot of things that challenge them. When Carey's wife died, as I mentioned, he remarries fairly quickly to a Danish lady who had come to India for her health. Carey had been instrumental in converting her, and then they married very shortly after his wife's death. There's a lot of opposition to this marriage from the team. They actually create a petition to try and stop it. His second wife contributed much more than the first wife. She was able to help with translation. She had some linguistic skill as well. She would die in 1821. Carey would marry again. That third wife was not as skilled as his second wife, and so there's not, she's still, helping, but not anywhere like the second wife was. There would be other difficulties that he faced later in life. A warehouse fire destroys a dictionary that he'd been using. It was very important. 2 grammar books, as well as several whole versions of the Bible that he had completed. He kind of believes it to be a judgment from the Lord. And he would also be rather active, not just in, kind of evangelizing, but he would also be active in trying to change certain practices that he felt were immoral in Indian culture. Infanticide was one, but also in Indian culture, a widow would often be, one of the cremation was frequently practiced. And so if a husband died, often the widow would be burned, a living widow would be burned with her dead husband. And so he really tries to get that practice stopped as well. Let's talk a little bit about some of Carey's missionary strategies, some of the things that he focused on. For Carey, as we've noted, he was really interested in the local language and culture, and so was the rest of the team. And so there was an effort to try and learn that kind of information. We talked about, of course, Bible translation, but also the teams would go into marketplaces and sing ballads like other people would do. Other people would just go in these marketplaces sing these ballads. Well, Carey and his team do this as well, but their ballads were evangelistic. Right? And so they're using this custom to try and reach out and share the message of Christ with the people. Another important effort was widespread preaching, going everywhere, preaching wherever you could. You know, it's not just kind of sit back and wait for the converts to come to you. Go throughout the region, preaching wherever you had the opportunity. A third thing that was important was Bible translation, as we noted. And we've noted this with a lot of different missionaries and mission groups. That interest in the people having the Bible in their own language was very important for a lot of missionaries, and still remains important for a lot of missionaries today. A lot of people, really concerned about, the importance of Bible translation as a means for creating and sustaining Christian communities. A fourth strategy, one that of course has also been prominent at various times, was the importance of establishing local churches as quickly as possible. A lot of people emphasize the community of faith, and so it's not just about these conversions, but the desire to get these people in communities as quickly as possible, get those communities up and get them practicing as quickly as was feasible. We kind of see something similar, of course, in Acts. And then finally, an important strategy that's been an important strategy for a lot of people is to train the Indians to become pastors, to become ministers as quickly as possible, and then turn the churches over to them. So again, yes, there's a lot of colonialism in this effort. Yes, there's a lot of things connected with ethnocentrism, but there's also this interest of raising up pastors from among the people that are being evangelized so that they can be leaders in these churches, and that it's not wholly dependent upon the missionary or the mission team. Why was the Carey team successful? Well, there were a couple of things that scholars have suggested as to why Carey and his team were successful. One reason was that they had a global view of missions. That missions was not just something to a limited region. They wanted to see the mission effort spread, but they also had a notion of, that people in England need to be concerned and active in sharing the message with people in India. Right, so that there needs to be these connections made with other countries, with other groups, to, work the missionary enterprise. The importance of Scripture and the importance of translation, right? So Carey and a lot of other Protestant missionaries had a very high view of the Bible. And if we believe that the Bible is the sword of the Spirit, and if we believe that the Bible is God's Word, as a lot of Protestant groups do, then that's the very important component in creating and sustaining faith communities and creating and sustaining churches, is having that mission, is having that aspect of community. I think as well, scholars have pointed to the importance of the respect that Carey and his team had for cultures, for the people that they interacted with. And so there's a recognition of, hey, these are people that respect us, they are learning our language, they're learning our culture, but then also the harmony that existed among that missionary team. That was very important for why they succeeded. In other cases, missionaries have not always existed together harmoniously, even if they've been on the same team. And we're not talking about competing teams here. We're talking about, sometimes situations on the same team. The focus on church planting and indigenous leadership is also often pointed to as a reason for why the Carey team was so successful, is the notion of, turn this into something that is under the control of the Indians as quickly as possible, so it is not thought of as an outside organization with outsiders exerting control and leadership and authority over native peoples. You want to get that leadership and support that leadership, encourage that leadership as quickly as possible. But finally, perhaps the most important thing was Carey and his team persevered even when they faced huge opposition. That was a very important aspect of this as well, is that they continued to go and continued to work and continued to try to share the message with people despite all the personal, the external, the health challenges that they faced at various times. When a new generation of missionary society leadership developed for Carey and his team, there was another set of problems that arose. These leaders back in England weren't as confident in Carey as previous generation, that first generation. They didn't trust him a lot. They didn't trust some of his policies. As new missionaries come in, they don't particularly like the communal lifestyle of Carey and his team. Sometimes they wanted more of the lifestyle like the Thomases had, right? Kind of, the separate lifestyle, a little bit of living at ease, where Carey and his team were not as concerned about that. They also didn't like the older missionaries giving them specific tasks to do, right? Kind of telling them what to do. The missionary society will eventually split from Carey, and they will ask for all of the territory and buildings connected to the missionary efforts be turned back over to the society. So all these things that he'd worked to build, except for the college. The college that they had started, they leave with Carey and the team because they're not particularly interested in it. They're not fond of the idea of the college. So that's kind of the one thing that Carey and his team are able to maintain. Well, this had, an impact on Carey and his team, obviously. They had been, up until this point, pretty self-sufficient, just a little help necessary from England. But, some of the increases in missionaries, a lot of people needing medical care, etc., so later on here, the financial need was greater, and then you're cut off. So that became a challenge for the team as well. Another important missionary team in these early years were the Judsons. Adoniram and Ann Judson. They were missionaries to what is now Myanmar. It used to be Burma. And they were interested originally in India, but they had the same kind of challenges with the East India Company. They come from the United States. They do have some interactions with Carey and his team, but they end up in Burma. Now, one of the challenges that is faced in looking at the lives of people like Carey and even people like the Judsons is separating history from hagiography. Hagiography refers to this idea of these stories told about the Judsons and others that are just kind of fawning over them and never present anything negative, and it's not true history. It's just a type of writing that makes them sound so great, everything's wonderful, and so it's difficult to tell sometimes what was actually fact from things that might get blown up or maybe overemphasized, things like that. Additionally, the Judsons apparently willfully destroyed some papers and letters and other things that would help the historian kind of work through some of these matters and ask, well, did this really happen like this? Some of those things have been lost. Adoniram Judson was born in 1788 in Massachusetts. His father was a minister. He would go to Brown University, where he would graduate as valedictorian. And during his time at Brown, he comes under the influence of a fellow student who is a deist. And so for a time, Adoniram kind of adopts some deist ideas. He kind of leaves Orthodox Christianity. He decides he wants to go to New York to become a playwright. There he doesn't stay too long. He's not very successful. He decides to return to New England. And as the story goes, he is returning to New England. He stops at an inn on his return trip. And there's this man next door who is evidently sick, and he's moaning in pain all night, and so he doesn't sleep well. And the man dies during the night. And the next morning, Adoniram finds out that it was his friend who had influenced him to deism at Brown that had been next door. And so this kind of gets him thinking again about, well, you know, is that really the course that I want to take? So he returns home. It's now 1808. You know, so he's 20 years old. His father is helping to start a new seminary called Andover Seminary. Harvard and other schools by this point had become Unitarian, so they're not teaching Orthodox teachings on the Trinity, but instead claiming that God is just one and not three. And so there are a variety of ministers that form Andover Seminary as kind of a response to this to try and you know, prepare ministers in the Orthodox teachings. Adoniram is encouraged to enter. He's still not fully you know, claimed a conversion experience much. He's not really dedicated himself to God. Things that you would expect somebody going into seminary would do. But through all of these experiences, he finally does kind of say, I'm going to dedicate myself to God. And after reading a message that a British missionary had given, he decides he's going to become a missionary. Right? He's not interested in staying in New England to preach. He wants to go out into the world and evangelize. Well, he tries to find some money to go on missions. But a lot of the American missionary societies are pretty new. They're underfunded, so they're not able to help. And so he and a couple others decide to go to England to try and get funding. Before he does, he will get married to Anne. Anne's sometimes also referred to as Nancy, is kind of her nickname. She is born in 1789. She also is born in Massachusetts. She's the youngest of 5 children. A lot of her early life was focused on the enjoyment of life and not really religion. And so, you know, she's not really particularly interested in religious pursuits. But in 1805, 1806, when she's, you know, still rather young, she professes conversion after she attends Bradford Academy, and one of the teachers there also does some preaching, and so she hears him preach and, you know, is really moved by this, and so she claims conversion. Eventually, she too would begin teaching school and was very concerned about her students and her students experiencing conversion. So, you know, she begins to have these spiritual interests as well. She meets Adoniram at church when the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions is founded. And so they come into contact with each other. They will get married in 1812 and leave for mission work. So Adoniram had gone to England, had considered signing on with one of the missionary societies in England, but the financial situation changed in the United States, and so ends up being supported by an American missionary society, and really is one of the first of the American foreign missionaries supported by these new American societies. On the trip over to Burma, instead of a honeymoon really, the Judsons engaged in Bible study to kind of prepare them for their work, discussing a variety of subjects. And one of those issues is baptism. And they become convinced that immersion in water is the scriptural mode of baptism. Now, they both had been baptized as infants, and so this really kind of leads them to say, okay, we need to really be immersed as believers, professing believers. And so they arrive in India, and they are baptized by William Ward, who was the printer that was part of the Carey team. And so they become Baptists. Now, they had been part of this American board. They had been part of the Congregationalist Church. And so that's what they were before their conversion. And so here's this American board made up of a lot of Congregationalists. They're not too happy the Judsons had become Baptists. The Baptists, on the other hand, are very happy. And so they create their own societies to support the Judsons. Well, so they arrive in India. They can't stay in India, and they kind of, move to Burma, as they're going to do work in Burma. On the trip, Anne will suffer a miscarriage, and so that is, that becomes a struggle for the family. As they get to Burma, they spend a lot of time studying the language. Anne gets the oral language down pretty quickly. Adoniram has more struggles trying to develop the written language. Again, translation is a big part of this. But there are a lot of other challenges that they face. They have problems talking with the people of Burma about some Christian concepts. A lot of the people in Burma were Buddhists, and they don't have a notion of an eternal personal God. So to try and convey that and get that concept across was a difficulty for the Judsons. They face some persecution from the government at various times on potential converts. That makes the work difficult. Sometimes there's toleration, sometimes they're not. One concept that was somewhat successful, or one approach that was sometimes successful, was the creation of an open shelter. So Burma had these open shelters where people could just kind of come and relax, discuss the day's events with other people that were there, listen to a speaker. And so the Judsons decide, okay, let's create one of these shelters, and we're going to, be preaching, handing out literature, and so people start coming. There's discussions, those kind of things, conversions, baptisms start taking place. And almost immediately, the Burmese converts become very active in evangelism. So this really kind of begins to take off. But there are other problems, right? So it seems like, things start going well. There are challenges. Things start going bad. Challenges, fever and other illnesses frequently hindered the Judsons. They had the miscarriage. Another baby would die of fever at 6 months old. Anne will eventually have to go back to the United States for health for a time. And while this is going on, Adoniram is working on a translation of the New Testament. Well, Burma and England go to war. And so even though the Judsons are American, missionaries, other foreigners are suspected of being spies. Adoniram is arrested, and it looks like he's going to be executed. The conditions in prison are terrible. Eventually, Anne makes it back. She has given birth to a baby girl. She's able to see Adoniram once in a while. She's trying to work to get individuals to free him. Because of the war and some other things that take place, Adoniram and other prisoners are moved from one prison to another one further north, and they have to march along the way. Some are in such bad health that they die along the way. Anne comes to see him. She's ill at this point and can't really nurse the baby either. So there's a lot of challenges they're facing, you know, that are really really struggles. Adoniram is finally released with the intent of he's going to be an interpreter for the peace negotiations between the British and the Burmese. And so while this is going on, Anne is in another place. Before he is able to finally reunite with her and continue their work, right? So he's working on these peace negotiations. Anne dies of a fever, and the baby dies a few months later before he's really able to get back. Well, he feels a lot of depression and guilt because of this, and he's focusing only on the work, right? And you know, he's just pushing himself and throwing himself completely into work and not even caring for his personal life and other things. You know, it takes some time for him to fully get out of this. And finally, he is able to get a translation of the Old Testament into Burmese. He's gotten a New Testament done. He will get married again to a woman named Sarah. They will have 8 children. 2 will die in young childhood. Another will die before adulthood. Sarah will die on a trip to the United States with the family. Adoniram's first trip to the United States in 33 years. And so he hasn't been back to the United States in 33 years, and his wife dies on the trip. 3 of the children had come along. 3 had stayed in Burma of the 6 children that they had. Well, Adoniram has become fairly famous by this time because there had been reports of his experiences, and he had sent written reports to various people. And so he goes around speaking about his time on the mission field to a variety of people, engaged in all this. He'll get married a 3rd time to a woman named Emily. She had written, you know, she writes a biography of his second wife, Sarah. They decide that they are going to return to Burma. The 3 children, however, that came to the United States are going to stay, and they're going to stay with 2 different families. He will never see them again. Emily quickly joins in the work. They will have 1 child. Adoniram gets sick, but decides to go on a sea voyage anyway. She is pregnant at the time. He will die on the sea voyage. She will miscarry shortly after that. She will take the remaining children with her back to Boston, where she will die 3 years later. So, you know, the stories that arise about Carey, about the Judsons, become very important for, again, this tapping into an interest in missions, hearing these great stories of this heroic faith, the desires to, you know, spread the gospel message, and these 2 families, especially, the Judson family and the Carey team, really set off a lot of people and a lot of interest in missionary work, especially among Protestants in Britain and America, that will explode throughout the 19th century. Even though, you know, even though there's a lot of heroic faith here, there's a lot of challenges and difficulties that they face as well. After spring break, our focus will again to be looking at the continued development of this missionary endeavor throughout the 19th century, and thinking about some of the efforts that people made in expanding the amount of people in the mission fields, financial support for the mission fields, organizations, missionary societies that are developed to facilitate those things, all of which are kind of, you know, the Judsons and Carey and his team are kind of the forerunners of all that and set the stage. So we'll pick that up in another session.